Let's now discuss crimes classified as to their stages of execution. Generally, they apply only to intentional felonies. It does not apply, or they do not apply to culpable felonies and felonies by omission. They also do not apply to offenses under special penal laws unless the special penal law itself expressly provides for the attempted and frustrated stages of the offense. Intentional felonies can be consummated felonies. When do we say that a felony is already consummated? A felony is deemed consummated when all the elements necessary for its execution and accomplishment are present. Here, the offender does not have to do anything more to accomplish the crime. In other words, the crime here has been produced. For example, X wanted to kill Y. X then got a knife and stabbed Y in the chest, resulting in the latter's death. Question: are there felonies which do not have stages of execution, meaning they are always committed in the consummated stage? What do you think is the answer here? The answer is yes. They are called formal crimes. Formal crimes have no attempted or frustrated stage. The felony cannot be executed without performing all the acts of execution necessary for its commission. Examples: physical injuries, whether slight, less serious, or serious. You can also include here mutilation. They are punished as to the result, meaning the gravity of the injury, whether slight, less serious, or serious, cannot be determined unless they are consummated. Another is the crimes of slander, oral defamation, and libel. Here, the crime is consummated the moment the defamatory words are uttered and heard by a third person. Third person meaning a person other than the person to whom the defamatory words pertain. Included in the classification of formal crimes are felonies resulting from imprudence and negligence. Because what is punished here is not the act itself, but the mental attitude of the offender. An example of a felony resulting from imprudence and or negligence is the felony of reckless imprudence resulting in homicide, or reckless imprudence resulting in serious physical injuries, or reckless imprudence resulting in damage to property. Another stage of execution is called the frustrated stage. A felony is deemed committed in the frustrated stage when the offender performs all the acts of execution which would produce the felony as a consequence, but which nevertheless does not produce it by reason of causes independent of the will of the offender. The reason why the felony is not produced must be due to a cause, or must be due to causes not attributable to the offender. Example: X stabbed Y multiple times in the chest and abdomen, but because of timely medical assistance, Y survived. Here, X has performed everything that needs to be done to end the life of Y. Y, however, did not die, not because X helped him, but because of the medical intervention rendered to Y that saved his life. Another example: X shot Y, seriously injuring him. X, however, was struck by his conscience and brought Y to the hospital, saving the life of Y in the process. Here, excess liability is for serious physical injuries only because of the absence of intent to kill. The reason why the intended crime was not produced was due to X himself, who saved the life of Y by bringing him to the hospital. Question: are there felonies which do not have a frustrated stage? The answer is yes. Some of these felonies are rape. In rape, as I have discussed in my previous video, no matter how slight the penetration is, the felony is deemed consummated. If the male organ failed to touch either labia of the pudendum of the woman by some cause or causes other than the offender's spontaneous desistance, the rape is merely attempted. If the offender spontaneously desisted, then he will not be liable for attempted rape but for some other crime like acts of lasciviousness. Another example of a felony which does not have a frustrated stage is the felony of arson. Why? The moment burning occurs, even if a small portion only is burned, the offense is deemed consummated already. If overt acts have been commenced, such as drenching the property with gasoline and lighting a match, but before it can be thrown, the offender was stopped, preventing the fire from touching the property, then the felony is only or is deemed to have been committed only in the attempted stage, meaning attempted arson. Another felony which does not have a frustrated stage is the felony of adultery. Here, since the essence of this felony is sexual intercourse by a married woman with a man who is not her husband, the same principle applies as in rape. Another felony which does not have a frustrated stage is the felony of theft and also the felony of robbery. They are essentially the same because in the crimes of both theft and robbery, the taking is deemed complete from the moment the offender gains possession of the thing, even if only momentarily. So, for example, the thief was already able to take hold of the cell phone out of the possession of the owner of that cell phone. Even if he has not completely disposed of the property, but since the offender, the thief in that example, has already taken the property physically from the possession of the victim, even if only momentarily, even if only temporarily or momentarily, the taking is already deemed complete. And if the taking is already deemed complete, then the crime or the felony should already be deemed to have been committed in the consummated stage. That is the reason why there is no frustrated stage of the felony when we talk about theft and or robbery. Now, if the offender was prevented from taking the property because of extraneous matters like the arrival of neighbors or because of the shouts for help by the owner of the house, then the felony is only deemed to have been committed in the attempted stage. After discussing the consummated and frustrated stages of a felony, our discussion of the stages of execution will not be complete without a discussion on the attempted stage of the felony. Now, when we say attempted, it happens when the offender commences the commission of a felony directly by overt acts and does not perform all the acts of execution which should produce the felony by reason of some cause or accident other than his own spontaneous desistance. Take note that when the felony is still in the attempted stage, there is something yet to be done, or there is something yet that the offender still has to do in order to produce the felony. Now, dissecting this provision in the revised penal code, let us first focus on the phrase commences the commission of a felony directly by overt acts. What does this phrase mean? When we say overt acts, they are external acts which, if continued, will generally produce the intended felony. It is a physical deed or a physical activity indicating the intention to commit a particular crime, more than a mere planning or preparation, which if carried out to its complete termination following its natural course without being frustrated by external obstacles nor by the voluntary desistance of the offender, will logically and necessarily ripen into a concrete offense, as stated or ruled in the case of Rait versus People. Here are examples of overt acts. First example, X shot Y but missed. This is clearly an overt act which, had Y been mortally hit, will logically result into the felony of homicide or murder or even parricide, as the case may be. Another example of an overt act is this. While X lay on top of Y and kissed her, X removed her shorts and panty and tried to open her legs apart against her will. This is clearly an overt act that commences the commission of rape. Another example, X bought a deadly poison and mixed it with his wife's coffee. His wife was about to sip some of the coffee when the cup slipped in her hands and fell. This is an overt act which, had the wife drank the coffee, would logically result in the crime of parricide. Question: ano ba itong preparatory acts? Are they the same as overt acts? The answer is preparatory acts are equivocal acts which still require another act so that a felony will result. They are actually acts susceptible of double meaning or double interpretation. That is, in favor as well as against the offender, and which show an innocent as well as a punishable act. It is in this sense that they are not the same as overt acts. A preparatory act is committed prior to an overt act, and unlike overt acts, preparatory acts are not punishable unless they are in themselves punished as independent crimes. Here are examples of preparatory acts. X buying poison. The act of buying poison is a mere preparatory act because it cannot yet be ascertained against whom it is going to be used. In fact, X may just decide to use it against rats inside his house. Another example of a preparatory act. X carried a loaded gun and headed towards or proceeded towards Y's house. This is a mere preparatory act because the action of X in carrying a loaded gun and going to Y's house is capable of double interpretation. He may just be going to Y's house to have it cleaned, to have the gun cleaned, or he may use the gun to kill Y. However, even if this is a preparatory act, X here may be held liable for the independent crime of illegal possession of firearms if what he carried was an unlicensed gun. Another example of a preparatory act: X proposing to Y that he kill Z. The mere proposal to commit murder or any other crime for that matter is not punishable unless the act of proposal relates to the felonies of treason, rebellion or insurrection, or coup d'etat, such that the proposal to commit the same constitutes an independent crime. The same goes for the mere conspiracy to commit a crime. It is not punishable unless the conspiracy relates to the felonies of treason, rebellion or insurrection, or coup d'etat. By the way, with respect to proposal to commit a felony and conspiracy to commit a felony, I will be discussing these concepts in a separate video. Just wait for it. Note, in order for the overt act to be considered as an attempt of a felony, it must be directly related to the intended felony. If it is not directly related, then it is not punishable unless by itself, meaning the overt act, constitutes another felony. For example, X entered the house of Y by passing through the window. Is X liable for attempted robbery? The answer is no. X's act of entering the house of Y should not automatically be linked with robbery, for X's purpose may be to commit another crime like murder. X, however, may be held liable for the crime of trespass to dwelling because the entrance is definitely against Y's will. What about the phrase does not perform all the acts of execution which should produce the felony by reason of some cause or accident other than his own spontaneous desistance? What does that phrase mean? Here, the accused is not able to continue performing the acts to produce the felony. He is prevented by external forces and not because he himself has chosen not to continue. Examples are when the offender's weapon was snatched, for example, or the victim managed to escape, or the offender was overpowered or arrested. These are examples of external acts that could effectively prevent the offender from performing all the acts of execution. Now, if the offender voluntarily desisted, meaning he himself decided not to continue with his criminal purpose, then he is not liable. Take note. This is an absolutory cause by way of reward to an offender who, having commenced the commission of a felonious act, heeds the call of his conscience and returns to the path of righteousness. The reason for the desistance, however, is immaterial. Take note. Here are some examples of desistance. X wanted to kill his wife Y and thought of poisoning her. He then mixed a large amount of poison with the coffee which he gave to his wife. When Y was about to sip from the cup of coffee, X got struck by his conscience and took away the cup from Y's hand. Here, X was not able to perform all the acts of execution necessary to commit the crime of parricide because of his own spontaneous desistance. Question: is he liable for attempted parricide? The answer is no. Although X here had commenced the commission of a felonious act, he will not be held liable for attempted parricide because his desistance is considered as an absolutory cause, which will absolve him from criminal liability. Same example. What if X desisted not because he was struck by his conscience, but because he decided not to kill Y that day? Will X now be held criminally liable? The answer is no. The reason for this spontaneous desistance is immaterial. Another example. X and Y got into a heated verbal altercation. X then cocked his caliber .45 pistol and aimed it at Y, ready to pull the trigger. Y begged for mercy. X took mercy and left. Question: is X liable for attempted homicide? The answer is no. X's desistance is an absolutory cause that will not make him liable for attempted homicide. But his act of pointing a gun at Y in the heat of anger will make him liable instead for the crime of other light threats under Article 285 of the Revised Penal Code. Here are more examples. X pointed a gun and fired at Y but missed. X was about to fire at Y for the second time, but X changed his mind and left. Question: is X liable for attempted homicide? The answer is yes. For X's first act of pointing a gun and firing at Y, he is already liable for the attempted felony. He had already commenced the commission of a felony by his act of firing at Y, but did not perform all the acts of execution which should produce the felony for the reason that he missed his target and not because he desisted. Take note here that the desistance came only after X's first act of pointing a gun and firing at Y. Another example. X stole Y's cell phone but returned it to Y minutes after taking the same. Question: is X liable for theft? The answer is yes. X is liable not just for theft in the attempted stage, but for theft in the consummated stage. His desistance by returning the property to Y came only after the felony had been consummated. Desistance does not have any legal effect in the frustrated and consummated stage of a felony. Take note that if the felony is still in the attempted stage, the offender still has control over his felonious act. That is, he may or he may not perform all the acts necessary to consummate the felony. In such a case, the offender here is said to be in the subjective phase of the felony. Now, if the felony is already in the frustrated or consummated stage, the offender has performed all the acts necessary to produce the felony. It is frustrated if the intended felony is not produced, and it is consummated if the intended felony is produced. In such a case, the offender is said to have reached the objective phase of the felony. It is at this phase where the offender no longer has control over his felonious act. To summarize, allow me to list down the fundamental distinctions between attempted and frustrated felonies. In attempted felonies, the offender has not performed all the acts of execution, whereas in frustrated felonies, the offender has performed all the acts of execution. In attempted felonies, the felony is not produced by reason of a cause or accident other than the offender's spontaneous desistance, whereas in frustrated felonies, the felony was not produced by reason of causes independent of the will of the offender. Now, in attempted felonies, the offender still has control over his felonious act. That's what I called in the previous slide as the subjective phase of the felony. Whereas in frustrated felonies, the offender no longer has control over his felonious act. The offender here is deemed to be already in the objective phase of the felony. In attempted felonies, take note that they do not include the frustrated stage of the felony, whereas in frustrated felonies, a frustrated felony necessarily includes the attempted stage of the felony. What about the fundamental distinctions between frustrated and consummated felonies? In a frustrated felony, the criminal purpose of the offender is not accomplished, whereas in a consummated felony, the criminal purpose was accomplished or is accomplished. In a frustrated felony, it does not include the consummated stage of the felony, whereas in a consummated felony, it necessarily includes the frustrated stage. Now, for both the frustrated and consummated stages, the offender no longer has control of his felonious act.